The photograph fell out of my mother's sewing box 3 days after her funeral. There were 4 people in it. I recognized myself immediately, even though I was only 6 years old. I recognized my mother. But the man standing beside her was a complete stranger. And the little girl holding his hand looked directly at the camera with the same eyes my mother had spent 40 years telling me I inherited from her. I almost put the photograph back. Then I turned it over. On the back, in my mother's handwriting, were 6 words. He never knew she was his. I sat on the bedroom floor for a long time, staring at that sentence. Because suddenly, I wasn't sure which part of my childhood had been real. My mother was the kind of woman who could make a small house feel like a safe place. She wasn't wealthy. She didn't travel much. She worked as a receptionist at a dental office for most of her adult life and spent almost every evening at home. She liked predictable things. Sunday dinners. Old movies. Fresh flowers in the kitchen. She kept birthday cards in a drawer instead of throwing them away. She folded grocery bags neatly before putting them under the sink. She never liked leaving dishes overnight. And she absolutely hated talking about the past. Whenever I asked her about her life before I was born, she'd smile and say, "There isn't much to tell." I never believed her. But I didn't push. My father had died when I was 9, so for most of my childhood, it was just my mother and me. She never remarried. When I was old enough to understand what that meant, I asked her once why. She looked at me for a few seconds and said, "Sometimes one love is enough to last a lifetime." I assumed she was talking about my father. Now I'm not so sure. The photograph made me question everything. The next morning, I called my mother's older sister, Aunt Margaret. I asked her if she knew who the man in the photograph was. There was silence on the other end. Not normal silence. The kind of silence where someone is deciding how much truth you're ready to hear. Finally, she said, "Where did you find that?" "In Mom's sewing box." Another pause. Then she said, "You should talk to me in person." I knew immediately that something was wrong. Aunt Margaret lived about 40 minutes away. I drove there that afternoon with the photograph sitting on the passenger seat. When she opened the door, she looked at the picture before she even said hello. Then she sighed. "Your mother really kept it all these years." "All what years?" She stepped aside and let me in. We sat at her kitchen table. I placed the photograph between us. "Who is he?" She didn't answer. "Margaret." She rubbed her hands together. "His name was Daniel." "Who was Daniel?" She looked at me. "Your mother's first love." That answer wasn't what I expected. I laughed nervously. "My mother's first love?" "Yes." "But what about Dad?" "Your mother loved your father." "I know. She also loved Daniel." I stared at her. Then I pointed at the photograph. "Who's the little girl?" Margaret's face changed. And that's when I knew. The little girl was me. But that wasn't the only secret. My mother had met Daniel when she was 22. They worked at the same supermarket. According to my aunt, they were inseparable. They weren't married, but everyone assumed they would be. Then Daniel got a job several states away. He wanted my mother to move with him. She refused. Not because she didn't love him. Because my grandmother was sick, and my mother didn't want to leave her. They argued. Daniel left. They promised to keep in touch. For several months, they did. Then something happened. My mother discovered she was pregnant. With me. Daniel didn't know. At least, that's what my mother had always told everyone. She wanted to tell him, Aunt Margaret said. But she was scared. Scared of what? That he'd come back. I didn't understand. Isn't that what she wanted? Margaret looked down. She thought so at first. Then she explained. My mother believed Daniel would abandon everything to come back to her. She also believed that if he returned, she'd spend the rest of her life wondering whether he'd chosen her because he loved her or because he felt obligated because of the baby. So she never told him. Instead, she married my father. Not immediately. They met when I was 2. My father knew I wasn't biologically his. But he loved me anyway. According to Aunt Margaret, he had one condition. He told your mother he didn't care whose blood you had, she said. He said if she married him, you were his daughter. I swallowed hard. So Dad knew? Yes. That hurt in a strange way. Not because my father wasn't my biological father. But because he'd carried that knowledge silently for my entire childhood. I thought about all the times he called me kiddo. All the school plays. The soccer games. The night he taught me to drive. The first time I brought home a girlfriend. He had never once made me feel like I belonged to anyone but him. I looked at the photograph again. What happened to Daniel? Margaret shook her head. I don't know. Mom never looked for him? She did. My heart stopped. What? Years later. How many years? About 20. Apparently, my mother had kept the photograph because it was the last picture she had of Daniel. She had found his address through an old friend. She wrote him a letter. She never sent it. Then she wrote another. And another. They were all hidden in the same sewing box. I asked Aunt Margaret why she had never told me. She said my mother made her promise. She wanted you to have one father, she said. She didn't want you growing up wondering whether you were missing something. I didn't know how to feel. Part of me was angry. Part of me understood. And part of me desperately wanted to know who Daniel had become. That night, I went home and searched the internet. I had only a name. Daniel Harris. No middle name. No photograph except the one my mother had kept. There were thousands of results. I spent 3 hours searching. Nothing. Then I remembered something. The photograph had been taken outside a diner. I zoomed in. There was a sign in the background. Rosewood Diner. I searched old newspapers online. Rosewood Diner had been in my mother's hometown. It closed in 1987. I searched the name with Daniel. Still nothing. I almost gave up. Then I found an old community newsletter. A small article from 1994 mentioned a Daniel Harris who had moved to Oregon and worked as a high school counselor. The age matched. I stared at the screen. Then I searched again. This time I found an obituary. Daniel Harris. Born 1953. Died 2018. I sat back in my chair. He had been dead for 6 years. I had missed him without ever knowing he existed. But there was something else in the obituary. A surviving daughter. Emily Harris. I couldn't explain why, but my hands started shaking. I found Emily on social media. I stared at her profile picture for almost 10 minutes. She had Daniel's eyes. There was no doubt. I didn't message her that night. I didn't even know what I would say. How do you contact a stranger and tell her that her father had a daughter he never knew about? I waited until morning. Then I wrote. I'm sorry if this message is unexpected. My name is Michael. I recently found an old photograph of your father from before he moved away. I believe there is something about his past you may not know. I deleted it. Typed another. Deleted that too. Finally, I sent the simplest version. Hi Emily. My mother knew your father many years ago. I think there is something you deserve to know. She responded 2 days later. What exactly do you mean? I attached the photograph. She didn't reply for 6 hours. Then, where did you get this? I told her. She called me immediately. Her first words were, "That's my dad." I said, "I know." She started crying. Then she told me something that changed everything. Her father had talked about a woman named Sarah for years. My mother. Emily said Daniel had always believed Sarah had simply chosen someone else and moved on. He never knew she had been pregnant. He never knew I existed. But apparently, he had never completely stopped wondering about her. Emily had found an old box after his death. Inside were several letters my mother had written him. The letters had never been mailed. Emily had kept them because she couldn't understand why her father had saved them. Neither of us understood how they had ended up with him. Then she told me. Daniel had received one letter from my mother years after they separated. It wasn't about me. It was simply a letter apologizing for disappearing. He had kept it. But he'd never received the others. Emily and I talked for nearly 2 hours that first night. She told me about her father. He loved fishing. He drank his coffee black. He hated birthdays but never forgot anyone else's. He had a habit of whistling while fixing things around the house. I laughed. My father used to whistle too. But then I remembered something else. My mother always said I had my father's habit of tapping my fingers against the table when I was thinking. Maybe I had more than one father's habits. That thought hurt. But it also made me strangely peaceful. Emily eventually asked me the question I'd been afraid of. Did your mother ever talk about my dad? I told her the truth. Yes. What did she say? I looked at the photograph again. She said he was the person she never stopped wondering about. Emily went quiet. Then she said, he said the same thing about her. A few weeks later, Emily came to visit me. She brought a small wooden box. Inside were the letters Daniel had kept. Most were from before I was born. One was written almost 20 years later. My mother had written, "I hope you're happy." That was it. Nothing else. No explanation. No request. Just 4 words. Emily also brought a photograph. Her father was standing beside a lake. He looked older than the man in my mother's photograph, obviously. But when I looked at his face, something inside me shifted. I wasn't looking at a stranger anymore. I was looking at my biological father. The man who had no idea I existed. The man who might have wanted to know me. The man who never got the chance. I asked Emily whether he would have wanted to meet me. She started crying. Then she said, "I think he would have spent the rest of his life wishing he had known." That was the moment I finally allowed myself to grieve for someone I'd never met. I went back to my mother's house a month later. I opened the sewing box again. Underneath the photograph were the old letters. There was one I'd never seen. It was addressed to Daniel but had never been mailed. I almost didn't open it. Then I did. My mother's handwriting was shaky. She wrote about me. She wrote about how afraid she had been. She wrote that she had wanted Daniel to know he had a daughter. But every year she waited made the truth harder to tell. Then she wrote something that broke me. Maybe one day she'll find out and understand that I wasn't trying to take you away from her. I was afraid of losing the life we had. I sat there for a long time. I wanted to be angry with her. I wanted to forgive her. Eventually, I realized I could do both. My mother had made a choice. It wasn't necessarily the right one. But she had made it because she was afraid. And fear can make good people do things they'll regret for the rest of their lives. A year later, Emily and I still talk regularly. She's become family in a way neither of us expected. We visit the old diner location together sometimes. The diner is gone now. There's a pharmacy there. But we stood outside once, looking at an old photograph on my phone. The same place. The same street. 40 years earlier, my mother had stood there beside Daniel, holding a little girl who didn't understand why the adults around her kept secrets. That little girl was me. And now I finally knew the truth. I used to think the photograph was proof of everything my mother had hidden from me. Now I see it differently. It's proof that before my life became complicated, there were people who loved me in ways I never understood. My father loved me enough to raise another man's child as his own. My mother loved me enough to make a decision she thought would protect me, even though it cost all of us something. And Daniel loved a woman and a daughter he never even knew he had. I still wish I'd known him. I wish I could have sat across from him and asked him about his life. I wish he could have seen the man I became. But I can't change 40 years. What I can do is stop pretending the past didn't happen. I keep the photograph now. Not hidden. Not locked away. It's sitting on my desk beside a picture of my mother and my father. 3 people who shaped my life in completely different ways. And sometimes, when I look at that old photograph, I think about how strange life is. One tiny piece of paper can survive 4 decades of silence. One secret can outlive the people who kept it. And sometimes the truth arrives so late that you can't change the past anymore. You can only decide what to do with it. For me, the answer was simple. I kept the photograph. I kept the letters. And I finally stopped being angry at the little boy in that picture for not knowing what the adults around him were too afraid to say. Because he wasn't supposed to know. He was just supposed to be loved. And somehow, despite all the secrets, he was.